4 habits practiced for just 90 days can quietly drain clarity, courage, and conviction without changing how religious your life looks. What if the habit you defended this week is the reason God feels distant right now? Most spiritual drift doesn't start with rebellion. It starts with habits you protect. Habits that cost you nothing today but cost you depth over time. They don't trigger alarms. They don't look dangerous, but they reshape identity from the inside. Today you'll see which one may already be doing that to you and how to interrupt it before distance becomes normal. 4 habits change them, and the distance changes. Picture a familiar case. A committed believer attends worship weekly, serves when asked, and prays when overwhelmed. From the outside, everything looks intact, but privately, prayer feels unanswered, scripture feels muted, faith feels thin, the explanation sounds harmless. God knows my heart. That phrase becomes a fork in the road. It can protect humility or excuse stagnation. This isn't rebellion, it's comfort. Picture a thermostat stuck at lukewarm. The system runs, energy is spent, but the room never reaches a healthy temperature. Nothing feels urgent until damage shows up. Revelation 3:16 names this directly. Jesus doesn't call lukewarm faith neutral. He calls it rejected, not because he hates imperfect people, but because divided allegiance hollows faith from the inside. Notice the shift before. Conviction interrupts your plans. After your plans interrupt conviction, the habit doesn't feel sinful, but it changes identity from servant to consumer. Nothing explodes immediately. That's the danger. 6 months from now, you'll still attend, still say the right words, but something inside will be thinner. Courage weaker, sensitivity duller. Drift isn't mystical, it's mechanical. Repetition doesn't just express belief, it trains it. Every morning, something gets your first 5 minutes. Whatever gets that slot eventually claims your allegiance. 2 people both say they value prayer. One prays 5 minutes every morning before checking their phone. The other prays only when crisis hits. 6 months later, their language sounds similar, but their reflexes are different. One turns toward God first. The other turns toward God last. Same vocabulary, different allegiance, same beliefs, different outcomes, because the reflex changed. We'll move through 4 habits that move outward. They begin internally and end publicly. Lukewarmness trains apathy. Unforgiveness trains superiority. Complaining trains distrust. Fear of people trains idolatry. Each one decides who sits at the center. Don't try to fix all 4. Identify the one that gives you an emotional payoff and comment the number 1 of 4 you recognized first. Habit 1 is lukewarmness. Before this habit, obedience follows conviction. After it settles in, conviction gets negotiated. The mechanism is convenience replacing clarity. The interruption is costly obedience. Sunday belongs to God. Monday belongs to survival. Prayer is sincere but conditional. Scripture is comforting but selectively applied. You don't lie outright, but you exaggerate numbers because everyone does it. You avoid obvious wrongdoing, but withhold generosity when money feels tight, telling yourself, God understands my season. You serve publicly, but ignore a difficult family obligation that requires patience and forgiveness. Each decision seems minor. None feels rebellious. Together, they retrain the question from what is right to what is acceptable. What you tolerate eventually decides who your God is. Partial obedience doesn't stay partial. It redefines authority. Erosion feels invisible until weight exposes it. God's anger toward lukewarmness is protective. It disrupts comfort early to preserve life later. Implementation step. Choose one non-negotiable act of obedience in the next 7 days that costs convenience. Not dramatic, specific, time-bound. Return something you kept. Speak a truth you postponed. Restructure your schedule so prayer happens before the day takes over. Lukewarmness survives on delay. Obedience breaks it with action. Habit 2 feels justified to almost everyone, which is why it's unforgiveness. Anchored in Matthew 18, Jesus tells a story about scale. A servant is released from a debt so massive it would take lifetimes to repay. Minutes later, that same servant demands repayment of a debt that could be covered by a day's wage. Before this habit, grace humbles you. After it settles in, grace shrinks in your memory. The mechanism is selective remembrance. You magnify their offense and minimize your rescue. The interruption is deliberate release. The issue isn't bookkeeping, it's perception. Before unforgiveness, your identity is recipient. After unforgiveness, your identity becomes judge. Here's how it shows up. Someone hurt you years ago. The offense was real. The wound mattered. But over time, every disagreement becomes evidence. Every silence becomes intentional. Bitterness becomes a management strategy. Control replaces trust. When grace feels small, offenses feel large. Unforgiveness doesn't prove strength. It proves you've forgotten your own rescue. God's anger here is protective. It guards humility. It interrupts the lie that you have moral leverage over others. The rule hasn't changed. Your position has. Implementation step. Name one person you've downgraded internally, not publicly, privately. Say the release out loud, even if no conversation ever happens. This isn't reconciliation, it's debt cancellation. Before, gratitude fuels mercy. After, bitterness fuels control. What you rehearse in memory rewrites your character. Habit 3 is complaining, illustrated in Numbers 11. Israel has seen the Red Sea split. They eat daily provision, and they complain. Before this habit, provision is recognized. After it settles in, provision is resented. The mechanism is narrative replacement. You retell the story with yourself as deprived instead of delivered. The interruption is disciplined gratitude. Complaining feels social. It bonds people around dissatisfaction, but it hollows trust. It sounds like this. Nothing ever works out. Why does this always happen to me? Other people have it easier. The facts may include difficulty, but the tone removes provision. The story you repeat becomes the world you live in. God's anger here protects perspective. Once the narrative hardens, identity follows. Same circumstances, different internal climate, because the story changed. Implementation step fast from verbal complaints for one full day. Every time one rises, replace it with a factual acknowledgement of provision, not forced positivity, accuracy. Habit 4 is fear of people, seen in King Saul. He admits, I feared the people, and loses his kingdom. Before this habit, God defines direction. After it settles in, public opinion does. The mechanism is authority displacement. You measure right and wrong by reaction. The interruption is visible alignment with conviction. Fear of people rarely feels dramatic. It feels practical, strategic, relational. You soften a conviction to avoid tension. You stay silent when clarity would cost approval. You adjust truth to keep peace. If approval is your compass, conviction will always feel extreme. Saul kept language about obedience but transferred authority to the crowd. God's anger here protects destiny. It refuses to endorse idolatry disguised as diplomacy. Implementation step state one conviction you've been silent about and act consistently with it this week, not loudly, clearly before. Courage clarifies purpose. After, approval erodes authority. Private compromise eventually demands public collapse. Step back, lukewarmness negotiates obedience. Unforgiveness inflates offense. Complaining rewrites provision. Fear of people relocates authority. Same love language, same religious vocabulary, different center. All four distort love by removing holiness. Love without holiness doesn't drift slowly. It drifts silently. The pushback is predictable. Isn't this fear-based? A warning feels harsh when you misunderstand the heart behind it. Rescue sounds urgent. God's anger in these passages isn't volatility. It moves quickly to stop erosion before collapse. Here's the closing shift. Don't scroll past this with insight alone. Insight without action becomes insulation. Decide which habit loses its grip in the next 7 days and act before comfort locks it in. If you feel like you're right on the line between comfort and conviction, comment line. I'll walk through a simple interruption checklist in the next video. The habit you defend today becomes the identity you live tomorrow. Drift doesn't announce itself. It feels normal until it isn't.